thank you for taking your time to be with all of us. There are infinite ways, implicit or explicit, microscopic or gigantic, episodic or lasting, superficial or substantial, of bringing into the life of another person some benefit, relief, cheerfulness, hope, well-being, intellectual or spiritual growth, or ecstasy. This kind of relationship is no angelic exception in a sordid world of selfish and warring individuals. It is, on the contrary, a normal event, often a part of our everyday interactions. At the base of kindness, it is service. We at the Domestic Violence Action Center see our media and members of our press as doing acts of service every day. And so for that we remain grateful. You are telling the stories in our community and helping to lift up the complex problem of domestic violence. So thanks for being here this morning. You serve as the messengers, and our working relationship has been a blessing. The Domestic Violence Action Center and the press. It's a way of helping to empower the community and our juries and our business leaders and our elected leaders. So this is a pretty robust partnership, we think. Every time we lose someone to domestic violence as a community, it's a heartbreaking event. Of course, it's devastating to the people who are losing a loved one or a family member. But as a community, there's a price that we pay, and it's very important for us to remember that and be inspired by that. It catalyzes us as a community to work harder, do better, become more of who we can be as a community. And so that's what this opportunity is this morning, really. Everyone knows someone who is or has been a domestic violence victim or survivor. I personally don't go anywhere anymore where somebody doesn't come up to me and share some personal story. My first husband, my daughter, my mother, my next door neighbor, my coworker, somebody. And the inclination to share those secrets and that truth is gaining momentum, as you have been observing, as I have, the Me Too movement. You probably saw Oprah's remarks last night. It was the 5 minutes I was in front of the television. I'm like, yeah! I timed it just right. So we thought it would be powerful to spend the morning thinking about this and deepening our collective understanding as you go about the challenges in your work and we go about the challenges in our work. I'm going to take a moment to introduce our featured speaker. Her name is Leslie Morgan Steiner. She's a beautiful woman sitting to my left. Few will have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events. It is from numberless diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped. Each time a woman stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, she sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring those ripples to build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Leslie Morgan Steiner has been doing this for some time. She can tell you a little bit about her personal story. She's an author. She's a TED Talk expert. She's a writer. She's a nationally recognized speaker. Got a very long bio, which I'm not going to read because her story is very compelling. You won't need to know what her history is. She holds a BA in English from Harvard College, written a book called Crazy Love. Her YouTube video has been viewed almost 2 million times, and you have the great fortune of spending the morning with her. So may you help me welcome Leslie Morgan Steiner.
Oh, thank you for that great introduction, Nancy. And thank you to all of you for caring enough about ending relationship violence to be here this morning. Thank you so much to the Domestic Violence Action Center for all your decades of work. It's really incredible, and it's exactly what communities like this need. The most important thing we can all do to end relationship abuse is actually quite easy, and it's just to talk about it. Abuse thrives only in silence, and secrets are very destructive, and so I just wanted to say bravo to all of you for being here today, because we're all together breaking the silence. And what I want to do this morning is to use my personal story to dispel some of the most destructive myths and misconceptions about relationship violence. The media has a powerful role to play in educating the public and helping communities stay safe, even when the biggest threat is inside our own homes, which is the nature of relationship violence. And I'm going to start out with some facts. And you may know some of these, and some of them may surprise you. The first fact is that I am a completely typical domestic violence victim, because there is no such thing as a typical domestic violence victim. Victims and abusers come from every religion, every race, every ethnicity, every income level, every educational level. It's everywhere. It's in this room. It's in every room that you go into. It's in every school. It's in every church. There are victims and abusers everywhere. And one of the most astonishing things is that quite often, when we are being abused or when we are abusing somebody, we don't even know that we're doing it. We don't even know that we are victims. I did not know, even when my ex-husband was holding loaded guns to my head, that I was a domestic violence victim. That's how strong the denial is. The most typical time in a woman's life, and 85% of victims are women, so I will speak about them in that way, although it is important to note that men are victims too, as adults, and most particularly as children. The most risky time in a woman's life is between ages 16 to 24. Women are 3 times as likely to be victims at this time, and that's how old I was when I first became a victim. Some other facts. Going on domestic violence calls is one of the most dangerous things that police do. It's an incredibly difficult thing to intervene in the middle of an explosive, violent argument like that, and it's very hard for the police to know who is at fault and how to defuse it. And much of the domestic violence community's efforts over the last 30 or so years has been educating police on how to intervene and how to help victims. And in my story, the police were absolutely critical in helping me, and I'm very grateful for that. One of the top reasons that women visit emergency rooms in the United States is because of domestic violence. The health costs to our country are staggering. And we very rarely quantify domestic violence in this way, but it's important to do so. A few other terrible facts are that the homicide risk in domestic violence cases is the greatest after the victim has ended the relationship. The first week is the worst time, and estimates as high as 70% of domestic violence homicides occur after we've ended the relationship. And people still ask, why doesn't she just leave? Another fact, I'm lucky that I didn't have to face this myself because I did not have children with my abuser, but in family court is a treacherous place for domestic violence victims. In 70% of disputed domestic violence custody cases, the abuser is given full custody of the children. There are many, many reasons for this. One of them is that we victims are terrified of facing our abusers. I was terrified to go into family court. I was sure that my abuser would use it against me, and I was also quite sure that the judge would believe him and not me. But it is an incredibly important front to educate lawyers and politicians and judges about the way that victims present, that there is nothing wrong with the fact that we are very emotional and hysterical, and that does not make us bad or unfit mothers. Quite the contrary. Another thing that plays into my own story is that if an abuser has a history of strangulation or gun ownership, they are immediately bumped to the top of the lethality scale. Because somebody who will strangle you or hold a gun to your head obviously is more likely to kill you. And it's important to know that, and most police know that. But one of the last facts I'd like to talk about is that most victims do not repeat the cycle. I am completely typical in this way. I had one physically abusive relationship, and trust me, I have no desire to ever have a second. And I got out because of community support, and I rebuilt my life because of community support. And that's where the hope is that everybody in this room and everybody in this community, if you understand the complex dynamics of domestic violence, you'll help victims along their way and to make sure that we never repeat the cycle. We have to hear about all of the domestic violence murders and the biggest tragedies, because we need to know that that does happen. But we also even more need to know that most victims are like me, that we're walking around, raising children, going to our jobs, going to church, being good citizens, and we have this as part of our past. And you might not know it, but you know a lot of victims who have broken the cycle. And it's really important to remember, because that's why we need to help victims, is so that they can break the cycle. Abusers have a much harder time breaking the cycle. The hope lies in helping victims. So I knew exactly none of this when I was 22 years old. I grew up in a family that had a lot of alcoholism, which is the same sort of dynamic that somebody you love is behaving very badly and you're expected to keep a secret about it. But I didn't have any violence in my life, and I was incredibly naive about domestic abuse. And I was one of those people who said many times that I would never be stupid enough to stay with a man who beat me. I didn't know that they don't beat you on the first date, that it's much more subtle and complicated. And I had just graduated from Harvard. I was working at 17 Magazine in New York. I was on top of the world. I was as strong as I'd ever been in my life. And if you had met me, I think you would have said, she's the last person to be a victim. And I would have told you myself if you didn't say that yourself. I never thought it would happen to me. And what did happen to me is that I met a wonderful man. I happened to meet him on the New York City subway. And he was working at a Wall Street investment bank where a lot of my classmates from Harvard worked. My sister knew a lot of friends of his. He had just also graduated from an Ivy League school. He was an incredible guy, probably the smartest man I've ever known. And he was also funny and self-deprecating and really into me, which was really seductive and flattering in the way, of course, you want it to be when you're falling in love with somebody. And he told me I was the prettiest girl he'd ever met, and he loved that I'd gone to Harvard and that I was smart and that I was working at 17 and helping teenage girls. And he told me these unbelievably romantic things, like that I was going to be a great writer one day. He told me something that no other 20-something man in New York was telling me, which was that I was going to be a wonderful mother one day. And it just cracked my heart open. I just felt like he understood me in a way that no person, including my mother, my siblings, my best friend from 3rd grade, had ever seen me. It was really heady stuff. And when domestic violence experts talk about the fairy tale beginning, this is what they're talking about. There is no defense for love like that. There is nothing that I could have done to educate myself or prepare myself for that kind of intoxication of having somebody see me and sort of crawl inside my heart and soul in that way. And every victim I know, this is how it starts. We aren't people who have low self-esteem. We aren't people who are foolish. We are just people who really practically randomly fall in love with exactly the wrong person, or perhaps are targeted by exactly the wrong person. All of the victims that I know have one thing in common, and that is that they have incredibly big and forgiving hearts. They are the type of people who will always give people second chances and are filled with love. This is exactly the way that I have raised my own 3 children to be this way. So it's a wonderful quality, but it does make us vulnerable. So the relationship happened fast. We fell in love very quickly, we moved in together quickly, we got engaged quickly, and we got married quickly. And I think that that is another very serious warning sign. But you know what? I was 22 at the time, and I didn't know any better. My ex-husband abused me the first time. Not on our first date, not on our second date, none of that. It was 5 days before our wedding. Up until that point, he had never even raised his voice. I did not know that he was angry. I did not know the rage that he had inside him. He had hidden it very, very well from me. I did know that he was a domestic violence victim himself. He had been terribly physically abused starting when he was 4 years old by his stepfather. And when I say abused, I don't mean that he was spanked. I mean that his stepfather viciously beat his mother in front of him, sending her to the emergency room regularly, which is probably the worst thing that you can do to a child. But Connor was also sent to the emergency room many times by his stepfather. Broken nose, broken collarbone, broken arms, broken ribs. It was a routine occurrence. So he had grown up with violence, but I tell you, that just made me love him more. That he had overcome it, and that he knew it was wrong, and he was really committed to breaking that cycle himself. I didn't know that it was going to be so very hard for him to break that cycle, really impossible. And I also didn't know that I was the last person on earth to help him. I thought I was the best person on earth to help him, and I wanted to help him because to me that's part of what love is. And 5 days before our wedding, he, as I told myself, he did not hit me, so I didn't think it was domestic violence. He strangled me, which I know now is much worse, but I didn't know it at the time. He strangled me, and he screamed at me, and he threw me down on the floor, and then he got in our car, our only car, and he drove to work. And I was sure he was never going to do it again. How would he possibly take that chance? He loved me so much, and I was so important to him. He worshipped me. You know, he wasn't going to risk losing me. And I thought I could take it. I thought I was strong enough to take it. So I married him. 5 days later, I put on my mother's wedding dress. The 10 bruises around my neck had just healed. And I took those vows, and I promised to love him through sickness and through health. And he promised the same to me. And then he beat me twice more on the honeymoon. And a new life began for me. A life I had never anticipated. I thought I was marrying my soulmate, and I was going to live some version of happily ever after. And instead, my life was filled with random violence. I never knew when he was going to attack me or what was going to set him off. He threw a lot of food at me. He threw food at me in the car. He pulled the keys out of the car ignition as I was driving down the highway, pushed me downstairs in our house, poured coffee grinds on my head as I was getting ready for a job interview. These were acts that no textbook on domestic violence can possibly capture. This to me was a 5-year-old child, not a grown man. And I felt increasingly sorry for him instead of feeling afraid for myself. And that continued when he got guns. We lived in a state where guns were legal, and I don't think it would have made any difference, but that was sort of the part of the denial, was that he said they were legal, and his company had a gun range that we could go to, and it's all wrapped up in it. He kept the guns loaded all the time, and once he had the guns, every time we fought, every time he beat me, he ended the fight by holding a loading gun against my head and telling me that he was going to pull the trigger. And even then, I wasn't afraid. That's how strong my denial was. And even then, I didn't know that I was a battered wife. I thought that I was a strong, smart, independent woman in love with a troubled man. I thought I was his protector and his defender. And that's one reason why it was so hard to help me and why it's so hard to help victims. We're in a psychological trap disguised as love, and it's really hard to break through to us. It is almost as if we are in a cult of two people. I was very fortunate, though, that I had two people intervene. And they intervened gently and kindly. They didn't tell me I had to leave him, thank God, because I would not have been able to. I did not want to leave him. I wanted the abuse to stop, but I didn't want to leave him. Once I had two people who knew in some ways, that was the beginning of me getting out. That was the most important thing, is that I broke the silence. In some ways, really, they broke the silence for me, because one of them confronted me first. I never would have betrayed my husband by talking about it. But somebody else knew and talked to me about it. And once people knew, I was able slowly to realize what was going on and to get out. And even though I come from a family of Harvard Law School educated lawyers and a very feminist mom, and in many ways a very close family and a huge network of relatives and friends who could have helped me, they didn't help me. In some ways they couldn't help me because they were too close to it, and also because they knew nothing about relationship violence. The people who helped me were people from my local shelter, people from the police station in my neighborhood, random strangers who understood how terrible domestic violence can be and how much help we victims need. And I tell you, none of those people felt sorry for me. I didn't feel pitied by any of them, thank goodness. They believed in me and helped me find my own strength. And none of them wanted to rescue me, even the police. They just wanted to educate me about what was going on so that I could get out myself. And the night of the final beating was, as you might imagine, it was a transformational night for me. My ex had gone for 6 months without abusing me, which was a really long time. And I was sure that we had licked it, that I had helped him overcome it. But that final beating was worse than anything else, exponentially worse. He barricaded me in our bedroom for a period of at least 3 hours. I don't know how long it was because I was unconscious for most of it, because the first thing that he did was strangle me again into unconsciousness. My ex had a black belt in karate and a black sash in kung fu, and he used it. There was no way I could get out of that bedroom by myself. And I knew he was going to kill me. And that really has a way of getting your attention. And I eventually convinced him to stop. And he broke, and he cried, and he apologized, and he gave me his house keys, and he left. And as soon as he left, I did something I'd never done before, which is that I called the police. And the police were incredible, because they knew more about domestic violence than I could ever hope to know. And they weren't overly emotional, they weren't hysterical. They just told me that they saw this all the time, which they did. And they told me that if I went back with him, that he would kill me. And I believed them. And the next day, it was my husband's 35th birthday, and I served the restraining order, the temporary restraining order on him that day. And I went to family court a few weeks later. An advocate from my local shelter went to family court with me, and that was the first time that I really thought I was going to be okay, because that woman, who was younger than I was, understood and was not afraid of my husband, and she wasn't afraid of the judge, and she made sure that I got a permanent restraining order. And I rebuilt my life. I had so many people help me. One of the most moving things, strangers are just incredible in a time like this. One of the most moving things to me is that I decided that, other people convinced me that it was really going to be a good idea to get the locks changed. I didn't think he'd come back, but people said I should probably take better care of myself than that. So I called a locksmith, complete stranger. I found his number randomly on through the yellow pages, and he said, "Well, it's Christmas and I'm busy, so I could be there in 5 days." And I just took a deep breath and I said, "I just left a man who was physically abusing me," and he said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes." It was people like that who made me feel like this was wrong, this was a crime, what had happened to me, and that I deserved help and protection. And I got it, and that's why I'm here today. And it took me a very long time to rebuild my life. It took me years. It took me years to be able to even talk about what had happened to me. It took me years to trust myself again, to get into a serious relationship again. It took me 10 years to write the book Crazy Love. It took me another couple of years to do my TED Talk on why victims stay. And I think it took me so long because, more than anything, I didn't want to tell the truth to myself. I didn't want to say that I had been a victim, that I had fallen for something that wasn't true love, that it was something that happens to millions of women and men and children every day. It's very hard to admit it to yourself and to realize that the person who you loved and trusted, that you gave them the ability to kill you. There are so many things to talk about and so many myths, especially when you start to talk about how the media covers domestic violence. I think that the first piece of advice I would give to anybody trying to cover a domestic violence case as it's unfolding is to turn to their local domestic violence agency and get them to interpret it for them. And that's really why we're here today, and it's really why one of the main things that Nancy does is to be available 24/7 to be an expert, because she knows more about domestic violence than anybody possibly could. And we develop a treasure trove of red flags and warning signs and ways to see what is really going on. So that's the first thing that I would recommend to anybody covering a story, is to call Nancy and turn to that resource. But there are so many other things that happen that are incredibly subtle about the way that we talk about domestic violence. And one of them is to recognize that our deepest wish is to make it not the perpetrator's fault. And this is really hard to wrap your head around, but it is why there is so much obvious and subtle victim blaming that goes on. We live in a patriarchal society when domestic violence has occurred for centuries. And we have a very hard time holding abusers responsible. And with good reason, because it's really hard, this is a really hard problem to fix. And in some ways, it would be a lot easier if it was just a woman's fault. But it's not. And by saying, why doesn't she just leave? We are really saying she's so stupid for staying. By saying, how does she let her children grow up in a home like that? We are saying that it is her fault. Even by saying she was abused or she was murdered, we are saying that it's her fault. Because what we really need to say is he murdered her. He murdered his child. If you don't talk about the abusers, you give them a cloak of invisibility. They become blameless. They don't exist. And we need to have this somewhat subtle but really profound shift. And yes, take care of victims, of course, but to also hold perpetrators responsible for their actions. And we have such an incredibly hard time doing that. So I'm just so proud of everybody here for engaging in this subject, for listening to me, for opening your minds to what is an incredibly painful and difficult subject and a really hard societal problem to solve. And I would like to say that I'm here to answer absolutely any question that anybody has about domestic violence. For better or for worse, I'm not a private person. And I've answered some really hard questions about this, about my own experience, about what I've seen in other people. And there's no question that's off limits. And I think it's the only way that we are truly going to solve this problem is to ask the really difficult questions about why we fall in love with abusers, why abusers want to hurt the people who love them the most, why our society wants to turn away from this and call this a domestic disturbance instead of domestic violence, instead of, call it a crime of passion or a domestic incident, instead of really naming it as what it is. But that's what we're here today to do, is to really do that, to look reality in the face. And I'm here to help in any way that I can, today or in the future. I'm very accessible. My material is accessible, and I'm accessible via email, and I would be happy to serve as a resource for anybody in this room or in this entire community, because I want to end this. I want to make sure that victims have the knowledge that they need to avoid abusive relationships or to recognize the red flags as soon as possible, and that everybody in this community has the information to help victims on their way, because nobody wants this problem in their community. We all want to end it. We just haven't quite yet figured out how to do so. But I'm confident that we are getting there, and that we'll get there together. So thank you very much.
Shall we pose questions?
We can pose questions, that's fine, yeah, that would be great, wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes?
How do you see ending it beside talking about it? I mean, what's the next step?
There are, I'm just gonna get my notes because I think I have a few extra ideas that I don't want to forget.
Oh.
Talking about it is the simplest and most powerful way, but there are lots and lots of other ways. Thank God for the Violence Against Women Act. Thank God for Joe Biden, because a lot of money has been pumped into our communities and our police forces and our shelters over the years to provide training and expertise on this front. So that does help quite a lot. I think that there's so many things. Okay, one is, this is another one that is simple but really hard to do, and that is to believe victims. If somebody comes to you and tells you that he or she has been abused, you know, it is incredible how our knee-jerk reaction is often to say, oh, but he seems like such a nice guy. Mm-hmm. Oh, but he seems like such a nice father. Oh, it can't be that your mother did that to you. So don't do that. Believe the victim. That is where we start with this. I think, you know, as I said before, to understand family court dynamics and how complicated it is. And what happened here and what happens in so many communities is that judges do not believe the person who is the biggest expert of all, which is the victim herself. If a victim says to you that she is worried that her abuser is going to hurt her or her children, do everything you can to support her and get her to safety, and get her the protection that she needs. Because if somebody says that, people are not going to lie about that. That is really, really true. There's a wonderful new video called, it's a documentary called What Doesn't Kill Me, which is about the family court system, and I would recommend watching that. There's also another very good documentary called Private Violence. That's a good resource. So those are things that I think will help quite a bit. I also think it's really important to, as the Domestic Violence Action Center does, to talk to teenagers about relationship abuse, to get to boys and girls early, and you know, to talk to children as openly as we possibly can. 15 million children are abused every year, according to the CDC. So you're not going to be shocking them by talking about this. A lot of them already know about it because they see it at home or they see it in their friends' homes. And it's very important to talk to people early and often about the risks of family violence. Other questions? I know there are more.
Is abuse generally one-sided?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So one of the points I wanted to make when I was talking about the police is that when police come into a domestic violence situation, it is really hard for them sometimes to tell who is the dominant person in the relationship. And that is key to know, because you know, when my sister and I used to get into, you know, like screaming punching matches when we were kids, that is mutual violence. That's not domestic violence, because neither one of us was trying to dominate or control each other. We were just fighting. So there are fights like that in families, but that is not domestic violence. Domestic violence is when one person is using power, and their physical power, their emotional power, to control another person. And so even if somebody threw the first punch, that doesn't mean that they are an abuser. And I just want to say, for the record, I hit my ex-husband more times than I can count. Because after about the first 100 times that he had hit me, I wanted to fight back. And I often knew that if my only chance to get in one blow was at the very beginning. And if the police had come in, my ex could have said, but you know, she started it. And in some ways that would have been true, but it really wouldn't have been true. So it's very rare that violence in a couple is mutual. And it actually is one of the most pernicious and deceptive tacks that abusers take, is to say, this is mutual. She's doing this to me as well. And you really have to know a lot about how complicated domestic violence is to separate that out and to figure out who is really the abuser here. And there's a lot of police training available, other kinds of interventional training, so that you can look for the really key tells in that situation. Yes?
Does the training differ when the abuser is the woman and the victim is a man or a boy?
Yes. That is outside of my knowledge area, but it is different. It's hard to capture. I think that it's different from both the victim and the abuser standpoint. Because men who are abused by women have a really hard time coming forward with it. Almost every time that I speak, afterwards, a man will come up, and it's just the same every time. He'll stand like a few feet away, and he'll wait till everybody's gone, and then he'll come over and he will whisper, my wife abused me, or my wife is abusing me. Because there's a different level of shame, and also, what most people do when a man says that he's being abused by his wife? They laugh. It's what we do in our society, because it seems like such a ridiculous thing, but it does happen. Physical abuse, I talked to a huge, like 6'4" truck driver whose wife was probably half his weight, and she abused him. And he had scars on his face from where she had taken a ballpoint pen and just carved into his face. So it happens, and it's harder to deal with. I also think, of course we know that it happens in gay and lesbian couples too, and that presents unique challenges in how to get them the resources that they need, the counseling that they need, the sensitivity that they need. But I think the thing that's the hardest is when there is no physical violence, and we're talking about emotional abuse. And it's just as bad as physical abuse. It's just as destructive. But it's not a crime, and it's really nearly impossible to prosecute. It's much harder to recognize. At least in my case, it was really clear to me who was. My mother used to joke. My mother is dead now, but she was very funny about it. Thank God. She said, it was very black and blue. But when it's emotional abuse, it's much more subtle, and it takes a very skilled counselor or therapist to help somebody find their way out of that and protect themselves. And also, you often get very little family or community support, because emotional abuse is, gaslighting is very, very hard to spot, even for the victim. Yes?
How do you respond to that sort of argument of I want to support survivors and victims without villainizing the abuser? What are your thoughts on that sort of conversation?
God, that is such a great question too, a great point. So much of our conversation about relationship abuse promulgates this subtle victim blaming and also the demonization of abusers. And I'm not saying that abusers should be let off the hook, because of course they shouldn't. But in talking about my ex-husband, so he was a victim too. He was, if you had met him as a little boy, we all would have advocated for him and tried to save him and help him. So it wasn't his fault that he grew up to be an abuser, but it was his responsibility to stop it. And I think that's an important way to not demonize abusers. And also, I want to tell you that I never would have fallen in love with a monster. And when people used to say to me, he is a monster, he's a terrible person, what I actually heard was, God, you're such an idiot for loving somebody who was a monster. So that's yet another way of kind of blaming the victim, is to call the abuser, a sociopath, a psychopath, all that. That's not, some of them are actually, because it's a spectrum. Some of them cannot be helped. But most abusers are people who were abused as children, who don't want to be doing this, and who need a lot of help. And if you think it's hard for a domestic violence victim to get help, can you imagine how hard it is for an abuser to stand up in front of other people and say, I beat my wife and kids, I beat my girlfriend and her children? It's really, really quite hard. So we have to be really careful not to demonize them and thread that needle of holding them responsible and insisting that this is completely unacceptable behavior to hurt anybody, but most especially somebody who loves you. It's really, really, really tricky. And I find that our society, after the strongest thing we like to do is to blame the victim, but the second strongest thing is to demonize the abuser and say that it happens across town in other families. And you'll see this all the time. The place that you see this the most strikingly is mothers of abusers. It's the same with sexual assault. My son would never do that. I didn't raise him to be that way. And we have to fight that, and we have to have sympathy for abusers while not letting them, not in any way giving them a pass. And fortunately, there are more and more people today running groups for abusers, doing court-mandated or voluntary abuse intervention with abusers with increasing success. And I think we need a lot more focus on that because that's really the only way we're going to fully end this, is if we get abusers to recognize that what they're doing is wrong and that they have help, and also to get the vast majority of men in our society who don't commit assault against women to hold the other members of their gender responsible for this and not turn a blind eye to it and not blame their partners and not say that their partners provoked them and so it's somehow okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
So I think a lot of times, especially in local culture, the community or neighbors think that this isn't my problem or I shouldn't intervene. When do we also hold the community accountable, and what can they do, to stop the violence?
This is so tricky because I believe that blame plays such a destructive role in all of this. And I wouldn't want a community, and also I think that shame doesn't work either, to say that we should be ashamed for not helping, for not intervening. So that's another needle that's really hard to thread, is how do you hold a community responsible, encourage people to intervene without making them feel horrible for not doing so. I think one of the most important things to do is to recognize that we have this very strong message in our culture overall, but really sort of every microculture too, that what happens behind closed doors is supposed to sort of stay there. Whether it's your tent or your home or even your car, that's sort of an invisible barrier. And I'm on the board of a wonderful advocacy group called the One Love Foundation that focuses on educating teenagers about relationship abuse. But one of the public service announcements they have, and my favorite one, is the couple is fighting and they have glass walls around them. And the community, the audience, is trying to break through the glass and they can't because it's so hard to get in there and to really help people. And what I have found helped me, and what I have used with other people who I'm trying to talk to, is a very gentle, non-confrontational approach. Not saying, I'm going to call the police, or that you're a monster for doing this, or you're a monster for not leaving. But to just say, very simply, to anybody who you think is being abused or witnessing abuse, to say, I'm worried about you, and I need to know that you're okay. We can say that to a child, we could say that to a neighbor, we could say that to a coworker, we could say it to a teacher. You could say it to anybody, I'm worried about you, something seems wrong, and I just need to know that you're okay. I think that is important. And I think the communities do want to help. They just keep coming up against this invisible barrier that's a cultural barrier about how you help. And I think that the only upside to terrible tragedies where women and children and sometimes men are killed or kill themselves is that it gives the community an opportunity to really talk about it and to talk about what they could have done differently and what people saw. Yes?
You mentioned the age group of 16 to 24-year-olds is particularly vulnerable. Is there another age group
that it spikes again, or is it just spread out after that?
The research that I know is the 16 to 24, and I don't remember how the arc goes after that. And I think it's a really interesting question why women and girls in our country are so vulnerable during that age category. And the numbers are something like that you're 3 times as likely to be a victim then, and that 500 women and girls in that age category are murdered every year by their partners and former partners. And I think a lot of it is that we're just starting out in relationships at that age. We tend to have bought into a lot of our society's myths about passion and romance. And also it is the time when abusers are flipping from victim to perpetrator. And so they're starting to do it. And I think all of that plays a factor. Yes?
I don't know how to pose this question, but I'm thinking with the Me Too movement talking about the same things, power using to harm, in most cases, women, how can the two, domestic violence, what you're doing, blend with that, and what paths do you see for making a stronger political force?
Well, the Me Too movement is so powerful and incredible, and to me, it is really one of these things where what that's saying is that a high tide lifts all boats, and that even though Me Too is really focused on sexual harassment and sexual assault, that it helps all female victims of violence, or of violence and abuse that tend to skew female. I think that what Oprah Winfrey did last night on television was really, really powerful and helped everybody.
Yeah.
And I loved your story, Nancy, because it was my story too. I was on the plane last night when Oprah was actually speaking live, and a sexual assault survivor texted me. She said, "Are you watching?" And I said, No, what did she do? And then I forgot about it, and I got to my hotel, and I turned on the TV, and Oprah had just started talking. It was like it was a message from me. It was so cool. So I don't think that we have to worry specifically about creating a specific Me Too movement for domestic violence victims. I think we're already all in that space. And the way that I see the arc is that regardless of what your politics are, in some ways Donald Trump has turned out to be a very, very good teacher and a unifier of women. And I was there for the Women's March in Washington. I have to say it was probably one of the best days of my entire life. And people asked all the time, "Oh, but what does marching do? What does marching do?" And I just thought, just wait and see what marching does. Because it brought all the women together, and I think that Me Too wouldn't have happened without that march. And let's just see what keeps on happening. I think that we are at a time of incredible change. And at the same time, this is something that Nancy referenced in her opening remarks. I don't think any one of us can end domestic violence. It's this massive societal iceberg, but we have our ice picks, and we're all chipping away at it. And so just keep on chipping, keep on talking about it, keep on trying to understand how complicated this dynamic is. Keep trying to cover this in your conversations, in stories that you write. Cover it in an accurate way. Learn more. There's so many resources. Talk to survivors. Examine your own history, because you know what I bet? I bet everybody in this room has a little bit of abuse there. And use that power to break the silence and to bring all of us together.
Do you have time for one last question?
Do I, Nancy?
Do you have time for one last question? Is that all right, or no?
I think I want to move us to the
no
next
worries.
part of our.
I'll take it offline. Come up to me afterwards, and I'd be happy to
no
talk.
worries.
Thank you all so much. Okay.
This is a conversation that we will continue to have. You can see that it's imperative that we do. I wanted to move us gracefully into the next part of our breakfast briefing and invite Tammy Morey, I was going to say an old friend of mine, but when you see her, you'll know she's not an old friend of mine. She's a longtime friend of mine. I met Tammy when she was a reporter at KHON. We had the opportunity to do a 3-part series on domestic violence. Tammy has gone on to give birth to twins and another darling daughter. She has been the communications director for the Department of Transportation and the Judiciary. She is now facilitating and managing a private consulting company. She graciously agreed to moderate a small panel this morning of local members of our community who have suffered domestic violence tragedies and willing to talk about what that experience, how that experience impacted them. And so I'd like to invite Tammy to join maybe Leslie at the table. You want to come here?
Sure, either way.
I mean, you're closer to the. See, she's not an old friend of mine. I'd also like to welcome Corinne Moreno, also who has graciously, generously, bravely, courageously agreed to join us here this morning and talk about her experiences as a survivor of domestic violence. Corinne, would you join us? And I would like to invite Diamond Badajos to join us at the table as well. Diamond will share a little bit about her family's experience suffering the harm of domestic violence. Another very, very brave gift to all of us. Catherine Ikau was going to be with us this morning. I got a text from her saying that she wasn't feeling well and wasn't going to make it after all. That would have been an enormously brave appearance. You know who Catherine Ikau is. She has suffered one of the worst tragedies imaginable. And so we're going to work together to help you understand what it's like to have your life and your story told by our media. Diamond is willing and will welcome your questions. I'm not sure how Corinne feels about that. So Tammy, thank you for serving as our moderator.
Thanks for having